All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Ananda, and I am a legislative assistant with the Modernization Committee. We are a temporary select committee that was established back in 2019, and we're tasked with investigating, studying, and holding hearings on making Congress more effective, efficient, and transparent on behalf of the American people. So this year, we've been bringing in experts in the modernization space on recess Fridays to talk about congressional reform and other modernization-related efforts. And today I'm really excited to talk about tech and the Hill. So today we're doing a tech off the Hill panel, and then in a couple of weeks, we're gonna have another one on tech on the Hill. So really excited to have this conversation today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful panelists, starting with Melissa. So Melissa Dargan is a former Congressional House staffer turned tech entrepreneur. She is the co-founder and CEO of tourtracker.com, which is a platform that digitizes the tour management process for members of Congress, and she co-launched the Congressional App Challenge. She also created Congress, a personal finance YouTube series for congressional staff interested in money tips, which has been super helpful for me personally, so definitely encourage people to check that out. Next, we've got Alex Kouts, who is the CEO and founder of Indigov. He's a Bay Area tech entrepreneur obsessed with supporting and strengthening US democracy. He's built and launched companies focused on civic engagement, machine learning, media and news, digital philanthropy, crowdfunding, and gaming, and has advised over 100 members of Congress, as well as representatives at all levels of government. He founded Indigov with the mission of meaningfully improving the user experience of representative democracy. And then finally, we've got Jonathan Marks, who is the co-founder and chief technology officer of Quorum, a DC-based startup whose public affairs software platform enables organizations like Coca-Cola, Walmart, General Motors, the Human Rights Campaign, and the United Nations Foundation to launch grassroots advocacy campaigns, manage stakeholder engagement, and monitor policy developments in Washington, DC, as well as in countries across the world. Jonathan's work with Quorum has also led him to be recognized as the EY Entrepreneur of the Year and one of Washington, DC's top 50 technologists. So welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you today. I'm going to go ahead and let everyone introduce themselves and their background, tell us a little bit about what led them to the work that they do today. And then as we go, if anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to start throwing those in the Q&A. We'll have plenty of time for that at the end of the session. So with that, I will turn it over to Melissa.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Ananda, and for Modernization Committee for hosting this brown bag lunch. I'm excited to be a part of it and to be aligned with other either former staff or individuals who are looking to modernize Congress from the outside. Just in terms of my background, as Ananda mentioned, former staffer, started off on the Hill as an intern, and then eventually worked my way up to be on the committee, and then left the Hill, started the Congressional App Challenge and launched that in 2015. So many of your offices are currently probably hosting app challenges across the country. And the reason why I had pivoted out of government and more into like tech and promoting computer science space is because I saw the need. When I was on the Hill, most members and most staff were using BlackBerries. And when I was pitching the app challenge in 2015 to promote STEM education, members were like, Melissa, what's an app? And that's when a light bulb went off. And I'm like, if members of Congress don't understand what an app is, and I had to explain that to them, that was one of the red flags. And then the second red flag that I saw was members were like, oh, tech is not in my district. You know, like we focus on agriculture, we focus on technology. This competition won't work. And what I had mentioned was, oh, but what about AI driving, right? What about the drone technology that a lot of farmers use to monitor their crops? And that's when they started to realize how much technology was important. And so to me, I think that there's a very big space for technology to, one, improve Congress, but also be a part of the bigger conversation and help democracy. And that's why I pivoted more so towards technology, because I saw that there was an interest. And then in starting Tour Tracker, tours were one of the bane of my existence. Many of you guys right now probably are not experiencing tours the same way prior to COVID, but as things start to reopen, tours used to take up 12 to 20 hours a week for a staffer to manage, handle, and host constituents. And I was like, we live in a digital world. Why are people doing everything manually? Why is it Excel spreadsheets? Why is it copy pasting from a Word document? And so that's why Tour Tracker was born. It was basically to empower staff to do what you guys wanted to do in Congress, to work on policy, to work on communications, and not necessarily just focus half of your time on administration work. And so excited again to talk about how technology has really reframed the government space, and excited to also be on this panel with other technologists here, because alongside them, there's been a lot of change that's happened and hopefully more change to come.
That's great, thanks. Alex, you want to go next?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So my background's probably a little bit non-traditional from some of the folks that may speak on panels like this. I'm a Bay Area tech entrepreneur. That's basically my life. IndiGov is my 7th company, and so done this for quite some time. And about 10 years ago, I fell out of love with the Bay Area because I kind of began to view it as the World Olympics of value creation rationalization. There are a lot of companies there that say that they're helping the world in some meaningful sense, but in reality, the smartest people in those companies are trying to get you to click on more ads or harvest more of your time or focus your attention. And I didn't particularly think that was interesting or, let's put it this way, morally righteous. And so, believe it or not, I started getting intensely interested in government as an antidote to everything that I saw in the Bay Area. And so I started building and designing civic engagement applications to get the average constituent engaged in the democratic process, not too dissimilar from Quorum, although more of a consumer application rather than an enterprise service that they have. And so that was meant to get people to read bills and reach out to elected representatives. And they would do that through apps that I designed, but unfortunately, they would never get a response. And so it was always a broken user experience. And so I started flying from San Francisco back to DC and randomly walking into all of your offices and just asking, hey, like, what happens here? Like, what happens to a message when it comes into Congress? Not knowing anybody, not having ever been a staffer or really having a lot of friends on the Hill, as I'm now blessed to have. And so what I found was abjectly horrifying. Offices were using tools built 30 years ago by defense contractors and other companies that were not fundamentally technologists, and they were ultimately failing to do their job. And I had an enormous amount of empathy for LCs because what we saw was an average constituent response time that ranged between a month to 3 months on average. And during COVID, we ran a test at IndiGov and sent in messages to all offices from validated addresses in district asking a middle of the road question about a policy that was in the news at that time that someone should have a response in their response library for, and only 1/3 of Congress responded at all. That's the legacy of bad technology or ineffective technology. And so I set out on a religious mission to find private market technology to replace the vendors that currently exist, which is exactly what IndiGov is. We realized that what most congressional offices do is customer service by any other name. And so we took the best customer service solution on the market, one used by about 300,000 companies, and then rebuilt it in partnership with that company specifically for elected reps. And so we've grown rapidly to the point where we're kind of the best kept secret in Congress, but we're now serving nearly 100 offices. And so we're growing rapidly. We also make our service available to state and local representatives as well. We've also been growing very quickly. And so what we've done to give you kind of a sense of the accomplishment or what we're most proud of is in the offices that use IndiGov, we've reduced the average constituent response time from months to a matter of hours. To the point where we had to build a delay inside the tool because responses were coming out so quickly that members were concerned that constituents didn't think responses were being considered enough. So we also integrate with 3,000 other applications. And so again, all of this was to bring private market technology into the House, which I think the House desperately needs. And I know a lot of you maybe on the call are looking at how to jump into private market kind of tech companies. The first thing is be a consumer of private market technology, use it in your day-to-day life. And so that's what we represent and the wave of change that we hope to bring to the Hill if we're successful in our small, humble, and hyper-specific way. Aside from that, I teach this stuff. And so even if I wasn't running IndiGov, I'd still be interested in this topic. And so a lot of the things we're going to talk about today, I teach as an adjunct professor at a couple of different public policy schools, because I love the idea of helping representatives and their staff be more effective leveraging technology. That's my reason for existing at this point. So anyway, that's me.
Thanks, Alex. And last but not least, Jonathan.
Hi, folks. It's really exciting to be talking with you all about these various issues. They impact so many different people, us and all of our customers, and all of people trying to get involved in representative government all the time. My name is Jonathan Marks. I'm co-founder CTO of a software company that's a little bit different than the other two here. We work with organizations off the Hill, so major nonprofits, trade associations, often government that isn't on the Hill, even some congressional offices, to help them best understand and communicate with the Hill and with other state governments, local governments, international governments, and so on. We believe very strongly in the value of these relationships because with IndiGov, so much of what you're doing which is incredibly important, is helping people in Congress reach back out. We think that there's value in helping organizations that represent so many different issues and interests reach in and try to communicate. And so it's fun to think about how our two technologies are talking back and forth with each other, even as we speak, which shows so much about how kind of representative democracy should happen. At the same time, even though we are off the Hill, so much of what happens on the Hill matters to us and to kind of the broader community. We have been thrilled to work with a variety of different organizations to promote open data standards around legislation, around getting access to things like Dear Colleague letters and CRS reports and kind of other very, very standard information that is necessary to understand how our government, how our elected representatives are operating on a day-to-day basis, but prior to the last couple of years was accessible to no one except for to organizations that could afford to pay for very expensive software. And even they didn't get full access to what was happening in our representative democracy. We also have the privilege to work with folks on the communications front of supporting different automated or open standards to communicate with Congress through the CWC program and other mechanisms to reduce load on offices and help standardize some of the huge amounts of information that are coming in. And so helping government to both tell the world about what it is doing and how it is working internally, and then helping the world kind of come back and tell government how it should be working better and better serving those needs is a big part of our mission, and therefore why these topics are near and dear to my heart, particularly because I have spent so many years of my life thinking about and digging into the many torturous ways that some of these when data is and communications are not handled well, how difficult it can be to turn it into something that can be valuable. So excited to be here.
Yeah, excited to have you. Well, so all of you have very different backgrounds, very different companies that you're working for now. I'm curious, since a lot of you touched on wanting to make Congress as an institution a better place and do kind of meaningful work, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of trying to change an institution or improve our democracy, really, when you're working from the outside instead of on the inside? And I'll just open it up to anyone who wants to speak first.
So I can jump in. So, I mean, I don't think you can make, well, okay, I'm gonna betray my background a little bit, right? I think one of the big problems with the Bay Area and kind of the way that technology companies are built there is there's a move fast, break things, kind of disrupt mentality, which I think is extremely dangerous when you look at an institution like the first branch, like the legislative branch. And so first off, I think you have to invest the time to understand there are a lot of things inside the legislative branch and the way that the House operates that are hard because they need to be hard. And there are things that are hard because no one has had a chance to innovate them yet or has had the ability to do that. And so it takes some time to really sit down and invest and really understand those things, right? Like I had a friend years ago who started a company to streamline the child adoption process, right? And he's like, well, it's tragic that there are all these kids who sit in these, queues and they can't be in happy homes, and instead they're in systems and things like that. So we're going to streamline that process. And so as he went further and further down building that company, what he realized was that it was actually a really good thing in some cases, not all cases, that it was an enormously deliberate process, a slow kind of considered process to get a kid in a permanent home. And so what he failed to understand at the outset, because he was a little bit too enthusiastic, was there's requisite complexity and non-requisite complexity. Things sometimes are slow for a reason. And so I think people coming in from the outside, so to speak, to innovate on the Hill, it's always a bit of a disadvantage because it takes a lot of time to invest in understanding that. before I founded Indigov, I worked with House offices for 4 years. I sat down with LCs and staff assistants and interns and caseworkers and district directors and chiefs of staff and members and asked them thousands and thousands of questions before I was ready to be able to make a recommendation for what they actually needed. It requires that humility and that like investment of time. And so I think that's a gigantic barrier. Aside from that, the Hill is an enormously small market economically. And so the idea of most companies investing an enormous amount of time in supporting the Hill when there isn't like a streamlined onboarding process, where there isn't like a really worn pathway for new cloud vendors to come in and sell technology, the Hill is also a massive barrier. And so in that sense, it also makes it harder to come from the outside. On the inside, you also understand the avenues of political capital and management of that political capital that can motivate decision-making in a meaningful way. Outside vendors are not really going to understand that unless they've come from the Hill like Melissa did. And so, you know, that's also an enormous challenge as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
From my perspective, I've seen a variety of like there have been some areas where we've found working with Capitol Hill incredibly easy and very straightforward, where those things I think align with the kinds of needs that that government has, and one example of that is the CWC project. For those of you, the acronym means Communicating with Congress. It's an initiative that was started a couple of years ago, where there are lots of different grassroots software providers that that are collecting millions and millions of messages from people that want to have a voice in representative government and send in a message saying, hey, congressperson, I don't like this, or this is a great idea, or, you know, support this particular issue. And it's a big part of, you know, if only a third of those are getting responded to, that's a problem, but it's also a problem if those messages aren't getting in. And CWC was a great program where there's now a centralized API, which enables kind of structured ways of organizing that information so that LCs can kind of see what group things by issue area more easily, and where kind of there's less load on websites and everything else. It's a great example of government making itself more accessible and making it easier both for tech providers like us, but also for just your average American to be involved. I think on the data side is where I've seen more challenges because in many ways, it kind of serves less of a kind of default interest of government to make information open and accessible. One example of this, a couple of years ago went to the conference for the National Association of Legislative IT Professionals, or NALET, where the kind of IT people of state governments in this case kind of all come together and talk about best practices. And there were all these phenomenal conversations around what different forms of XML can we use to structure the actual text of the legislation that we're introducing, and can we use that to figure out where amendments go in and build this beautiful data model that all makes sense. And I kind of raised my hand. I was like, folks, like, this is great and important, but you realize that there are 2 state websites that have publicly accessible APIs. And of those 2, only one actually has the same fields that are present on the website and actually presents all of this information in one place. This is very similar to where the federal government was several years ago, when everything was available via thomas.gov, and there were no kind of bulk data dumps or any kind of API accessibility to even fundamental bills, which is been a huge area of improvement at the federal level. And I was like, I'd happily build it. Like, you know, I like literally, I made the offer to these folks, like literally for free. Our company would happily provide an API layer so that this information could become accessible. It doesn't really serve our business interests. It's just important, and it would, you know, it would like, we have to do it anyway to collect and structure the information. Like, let's work together. And sadly, the messaging I got back was, I'm not sure that our elected government would be so happy about the information about what they're doing becoming so publicly accessible. And that's similar language that I've heard around other data sets that are a pain to get your hands on. For years, CRS reports, which are written by the Library of Congress for Congress to understand what issues are important and how the complexity of different laws might impact different things, incredibly important, paid for by taxpayers, weren't publicly accessible until even just a couple of years ago. I think it was 2 years ago that that a great nonprofit that we worked with made those public. And it's that I think has been a really big challenge, where it's sad that the incentive is to keep things secret, and in some cases, but it's, I've seen multiple times when it kind of interests align, it's possible. The resources exist. Government can make these things happen, like the CRS project, our CWC project of communicating with Congress. I would love to see more of that, and that's something that we put our kind of time and energy and dollars towards, to try and make more of that information accessible.
And just to add on to this, so being a former staffer and then eventually starting Tour Tracker and then running even the Congressional App Challenge, a big disadvantage for somebody coming from the outside would be, as Alex had mentioned, like not knowing the culture and infrastructure of the Hill, because it's actually very intricate and there are so many things about the Hill that make it unique and dynamic, that if a company were to come in and not understand how the Hill works, but try and provide a market solution outside and implement it to the Hill, a lot of that stuff would fail because it isn't actually solving the problems that the Hill has or that a congressional office needs. And so I think understanding the culture and infrastructure of how a Hill office runs is very important. And for staffers who are currently on this call, you eventually, if you decide to leave the Hill, you have a repository of knowledge, whether you know it or not, on policy, on how a congressional office works, that is very, very valuable, not only to, lobbying offices, but even to tech companies who are looking to innovate the way government and Congress works. The other thing I will say that is a disadvantage for a company coming from the outside is the mentality on the Hill sometimes. And I noticed this even when I was on the Hill, where if you come up with a new even policy idea or a new tech idea, and you're like, hey, I think this would be great for the office. A number of times, I know a number of older staff, chiefs of staff, who would say, well, why fix what isn't broken? And it was so frustrating to me, because I'm like, just because it's not broken doesn't mean it's not, or doesn't mean it's the most efficient and effective way to do this process. And so that was really hard, especially also coming from the outside, when you need to build trust with an office, especially when you're just starting a new company and this is the first time your technology is going to be used. You need to get beta adopters, right? The early adopters on the Hill, there are a number of them, and there are a number of staffers who are hungry for new technology, which is great. And if you're coming from the outside, finding those key staff and member offices who care about tech, who care about innovating government, is very key and crucial, I think, to the beginning and future success of any company, tech startup on the Hill. The last thing I will say about an advantage of coming from the outside and innovating in is, whenever I would ask my CTO, hey, Neil, can we build XYZ? Because a staffer would give us feedback on our platform. And that's the way we built Tour Tracker. We did like a base platform and then built it based on staff feedback. Because just because I was a staffer doesn't mean I know everything that's happening on a day-to-day basis for tours. When staffers would give us feedback, I'd be like, hey, Neil, 10 offices asked for this. Like, can we build this feature? And he's like, Melissa, stop asking me just tell me how to do it and what requirements you need, and I will build it. And that's the different mentality of coming from the outside. It isn't anymore asking, can we do this? Or what are the constraints and parameters, like it is on the Hill? It's like, tell me what you want to draw. Give me a blank canvas and I'll do it for you. And I think that was a really good advantage of coming from the outside, because that was a different mentality that I had to shift. It was like, wow, I can do anything I want. Here's what I want to build. And so those are just some of the disadvantages and advantages that I see from the outside trying to innovate in, that I think are helpful to put into perspective.
For sure. Well, and I'd love to talk a little more about, a couple of you mentioned that challenge of just the fact that the Hill is a small market. And if you're someone who cares about making, Capitol Hill a better place, and, how do you create a sustainable business model? What are some of the barriers to innovation and creating sustainable civic technology that's long lasting? And how do we
Yeah, what a question. I mean, that's such a that's the, you can't say $1 billion question. $1 million question maybe, but that's tough. I mean, so first I'll tell you what some of the barriers look like, right? So we're the first cloud-based CMS that the House has ever approved. It's not a roadmap really for us to do that. The CAO worked diligently and they brought in additional people from the outside to do like cloud-based services and like security scans of us and all those kinds of things, but there was no roadmap, right? And so as the CEO of the company, I had to look at the House and I was like, okay, I'm going to eat an enormous amount of upfront sales costs for a question at the end as to how much revenue is going to come in. And the only reason that I did that is I'm insane. And my entire religious mission on this earth is to help Congress operate more effectively, to make staffers' lives easier, to make constituent experiences better. So I spent an enormous amount of my own money funding Indigo to make that possible. That is not something that most companies will do. It is a really difficult return on investment for someone to consider, even if that was moved forward much more quickly, which I think would present significant security concerns. That's really problematic. And so that's just rough. You know, I think the legislative branch likes to do things their own way, which there's a lot of good reasons for that. But for instance, like, you know, someone being on the GSA schedule for FedRAMP, you know, doesn't mean that a legislative branch office can purchase or use that tool, right? There's literally nothing there that connects those two. I think it's a good on-ramp. And so, you know, our base level infrastructure was FedRAMP compliant, which helped us with the approval process. But, you know, that difference is massive. You know, the other thing is I know the House is looking at like group purchasing, you know, for different types of things, which could increase the economic, you know, value for like external companies. But even still, that's a rough one from a support cost perspective. So I don't know. I mean, it's a complex issue to do that, but you really need like passionate people. And so I do think it's amazing if people from the inside can come. And actually, there's some people on the call, like I recognize their names who are kind of tech forward and have a lot of big ideas for what the House should do. I mean, you can do incredible things if you engage vendors externally from being a staffer, like through the CAO or the Committee on House Admin and Select Committee. There's ways you can bring people to the table to have conversations, which could meaningfully accelerate adoption or like approval for some of them. So there are ways to do it. It just, you got to really want it. If that makes sense.
Jonathan or Melissa?
I think that was well said, covered all the bases for me.
I think that we do sell to the Hill. We have multiple different offices that like get value from our tools. We're not totally targeted at it, but much of the functionality that we provide of understanding what's happening in Capitol Hill and communicating with other people in Capitol Hill and keeping track of what people are saying is something that makes sense for offices to be able to do. What I can tell you is that the total amount of revenue that we've ever generated from Capitol Hill is less than our average single contract. And I would love to build tools. Like there's so many cool things that we feel that with the data that we have, which everyone should have access to and so on, that we could build. It's hard to make the investment work, and I applaud Alex and Melissa for building businesses that are so targeted at this important space. For us, a lot of the value that we are trying to generate, it comes from, it's much more in the private sector, but it is incidental to the business mission, which is to build a business and generate value for our users, but still is really, really important. It would be phenomenal if there are ways to make the kind of open to access to data and easier communication, everything else core to the business proposition as well. Because as an entrepreneur, I believe that things that have good business propositions generally eventually have good solutions, and there's definitely need for good solutions in so many of these different areas.
Yeah, just to jump on one other thing I forgot, which is an interesting story. So I can't take full credit or maybe even partial credit for MailChimp now being approved on the Hill, but like back before all that process happened, I was just like, the House needs better like email newsletter marketing tools. Like offices love sending out newsletters, and MailChimp is incredible. And if I was in the private market, I would use MailChimp or Klaviyo or something like that, or Constant Contact, which is approved Hill vendor. But so but I desperately wanted MailChimp because we have an integration with MailChimp out of the box. I desperately wanted them to be available on the Hill. And so I knew a bunch of the C-level executives there, and I had a phone call with them. I was like, all right, there's this amazing market. Think about the marketing value of being able to say you serve members of Congress. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if you all were approved and went through this process? And so they're like super skeptical, let's put it that way, and then started asking me some questions about how the Hill does things. And so I was like, yeah, well, it's newsletters, people opt in and that kind of thing. They're like, well, do they purchase lists? And I was like, yeah, they purchase lists. And they were like, absolutely not. There's no way we're going to work with the Hill if they're purchasing lists. That will burn through our IP gateway health ratings, and that make it unsustainable for us to run a business. And I was like, oh, that's horrifying. And so I kept like kind of, chipping away at them over the succeeding couple months. And eventually like the CAO and HIR really got together and they provided them with a pathway to get approved. But even the way that the Hill uses technology will turn off a lot of external vendors because it's not in their best self-interest. Like sending out bulk franked mail, like to non-opted in lists in large volume, there's no ESP in the market that's going to be okay with that. AWS SES, like if you were using Amazon Web Services, like email send service, like their IP gateway health rating, like risk tolerances are so low that people couldn't even send frank mail using a tool that every other company uses for infrastructure. You probably couldn't use SendGrid. Maybe you could use SparkPost. It's a really weird thing. And so even though there are tools that are available in the private market, and even if you can get them approved in the House, the way the congressional offices want to use some of them will count them out of being able to. So there's a cultural stuff too internally that needs to be changed. And I had a meeting with the franking committee the other day. And they were echoing the sentiments, like they know it's a problem, but offices are kind of addicted to doing it, and it's part of how they operate. So there are other things outside of technology and procurement and security scans that are problematic too, that we have to call out.
Yeah, I think also in the SaaS world, churn is king. Like revenue growth is really important, but so is building long-term relationships. I think something that is tough in selling, that is easy when you're selling to standard government, is there is no churn, so to speak. Like selling into agencies is a great business model because once you get over the crazy hurdles that is necessary to sell to government, there are users that need you, there is value you can generate, there is long, like big opportunities, there's long recurring contracts, there's opportunities for both business and world impact if you sell to the government. Selling to the House or selling to the legislative branch is not like selling to government. There's in many ways just as much kind of overhead to get in there, in terms of getting approvals and everything else. But the state of democracy is that people come and people go. And the other state of our budgets in our country, which has never made sense to me, is that we don't fund the legislative branch sufficiently to, as a country, to do their work really well. Which is a whole separate issue that reflects some of my personal opinions politically. But if you're going to go put in all of this effort to get over these humps, to deal with some of the facts that the Congress is different. You mentioned, Alex mentioned, I think the franking example is a great one, around email reputation and everything else. You can get over all of these things if there's a market opportunity. And I think if there were more avenues for group purchasing, for like selling things to the House or to the Senate instead of selling things to individual offices that will go churn and come and go and everything else, that is something that I think could have an impact in kind of making businesses more desirable to go in.
The one thing I will add to that too, outside of barrier of scale and size, is when member offices purchase, and this goes on to like bulk purchasing, individual offices are like their own small business, right? They can purchase and buy whatever technology they want, assuming that it is approved by the House or the Senate. And what's crazy is like, they have to justify any of their purchases because the MRA is finite, right? Every member office is not a revenue generating company. And so they're given an allotted amount, the MRA, to spend as they please, but that has to include everything the office spends on, from member travel to newsletters to your salary. And so in spending on technology, a lot of the times when staffers are pitching this new technology to be like, hey, I really want this, I really need this, it has to justify, like the cost has to justify what the office is going to pay for. And the way the chiefs of staff think about it are, all right, is this the best way to use our limited dollars to pay for what technology we're going to get. Is the ROI going to work? And then also think about it. You guys are essentially spending taxpayer dollars, right? And so a lot of the conversation around even purchasing new technology, a barrier is also the MRA and how much money each office gets, because it's a zero-sum game. You're given a finite amount. Whatever you purchase, it's not like you'll make more money and more profits later so you can purchase more. You're given a finite amount every year, and whatever you don't use, you lose at the end of the year, and then it starts over again January the 1st, at least for the house. So that's also a barrier, because now tech is competing against other tech to like for those dollar amounts, and offices sometimes have to make trade-offs. It's like, cool, do we want this technology or this one? Because even though they want all of it, they can't afford it. Or they're like, all right, what are we going to cut? And no one wants to cut their staff salaries. No one wants to cut member travel. You know what I mean? So I think that's something too to consider in terms of barriers. It isn't just the House and the Senate are smaller in scale. And so, you know, like building $1 billion company, just focusing on the legislature is probably not going to happen. And you do need passionate people, but it's also like you're fighting for dollars that everybody else is fighting for in the member office.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to make sure we have time to open it up for audience questions. So everyone, again, feel free to use the Q&A function or raise your hand and ask live if you'd like to. While we're waiting to see if any others come in, the first one we've got is just what is the advice that you might have for staffers who want to do something similar, especially Melissa, I'd love to start with you since you did that very direct Hill staff to the current job that you have now, if you want to go the entrepreneurial route. Yeah, thoughts for other staff who are thinking of doing the same.
So if you want to go the entrepreneurial route, really think outside the box and find real problems. And there are two routes to this, right? Like, do you want to go the entrepreneurial route and build technology or a company to support government? Then you can lean on your experience and find real needs to then build a company around. So for me, right, with Tour Tracker, I realized something that needed innovation was the way member offices were doing tours. They were doing it very manually. Staffers were like, this is the worst. And so that was something where we started to build a company around the needs. And that's something I would say with your experience on the Hill, if you're really passionate about innovating government, utilize and lean on what your knowledge is and find the needs now, because then when you launch off, that's something too that you can build. Also, I started working on the Tour Tracker piece of this project in business school, but I also started the first iteration of my company was like building apps for members of Congress. And that didn't work out. And that was probably like 9 months of me like seeing if it would fit, talking to member offices, sort of like what Alex was doing, like, hey, tell me more about what your needs are. And you have to understand that if you go the entrepreneurial route, like being okay with learning how to fail is fine. And then from that failure, picking up on what actual needs are and building off of that is important. Because I'm going to tell you off the gate, like it was not easy to start the company, especially with the barriers that you could possibly face in general, not just being an entrepreneur, but then being an entrepreneur in civic technology. So that's just something to say. If you are thinking about jumping into this space, figure out if you want to be in like civic tech and then find a need based on your experience. If you want to jump out and think about a brand new idea and build a company outside of government, that's also a different route. And you really just need to focus on a need and then build it, but you can't fully start big. One of the biggest things, and you'll probably hear this from the other panelists, is like you need to find a need, drill down on that niche and start to build something small first, see if it works. Like for me, when I launched Tour Tracker, I had 2 or 3 offices before fully going to scale to make sure that the product works, that people like it. And then from there, you can grow your idea into something bigger. So that's just my 2 cents on how to pivot from the Hill onto civic technology. And that's just a couple of things that I think are important to consider if you are looking to jump off the Hill.
Yeah, Those are good advice. I mean, I definitely want to echo that. So as someone who's been through this a lot of times, I will tell you, entrepreneurship sucks. It sucks so bad. It's so hard. And it's like sprinting in a marathon for so long. And it doesn't get easier the longer you do it either. Like, now, I imagine if some of you worked in campaigns, it's not too dissimilar in the sense that like everybody's sprinting all the time, everything's crazy. And it like, you're like, this is terrible. And then like you leave and you get kind of broken by it in weird ways. And then you just come back and do it repeatedly. Like it becomes like weirdly addicting. I imagine entrepreneurship is probably not too dissimilar from that in the sense that like every time I'm done with a company, whether or not it has a positive outcome or not, I'm just like, okay, I'm never doing that again. And then I do it again. And so it just, I think that's maybe part of it. If you are thinking to start something, there's a couple of things I would consider. One, what Melissa said, you have to become the world's leading expert in a hyper specific problem. The more specific, the more defined, the better it is. One of the problems that I see, and I advise a lot of baby startups that are looking to create products, is often what you find is a founder that's in love with a particular solution. Like they love AR, VR, they love Bitcoin, they love blockchain, and they want to start a company in it. Solutions in search of problems at the beginning of a company fails 100% of the time. That's one of the biggest sins that I see entrepreneurs create. The other gigantic one is that they believe that technology will change behavior. Technology does not change behavior. It's you're like, well, it'd be really cool if people did this thing that they don't do now. And so I'm going to create this tool and then it'll be easier for them to do it. And it's going to be important because they should do it. It's important. That doesn't work either. Technology does not change behavior. It accommodates and it accelerates it. Technology is an engine of convenience. The other thing that I would consider is that there are three categories of companies in the world. There are things that I need to do, like I have to do this thing right now. Like I have to buy groceries, I have to live in a house, I have to survive and drink water. And it's very easy to build billion-dollar companies, relatively speaking, easy to build billion-dollar companies in the need to do category because the need is there, right? Like the gap in the market is there. Then there's things that I want to do, like social media and gaming. That's a lot harder to build into billion-dollar companies, but it's possible because you can make a want to do feel like a need to do. That's what luxury brands do, right? That's massive. And then the third and final category is things that I should do, right? Like I should be civically engaged. I should manage my finances. I should manage my health proactively. That's really, really hard to build large scale businesses in because the need isn't strong enough. The ones that are successful in this space marginally move things that I should do into something that I want to do, like gamification. So you do like, gamification of steps and things like that. I should take care of my health. Gamification tends to be fleeting and doesn't drive like significant lock in the long term. And those companies tend not to be very healthy if they rely on that. So that's huge. And so if you're going down that world, do a lot of investigation. There's a question here from Yuri, the solution in search of problem. How do you convince founders and customers and investors to focus on problems first? Well, for founders, you shouldn't have to convince them, right? Like that should be the entire seed of their world. For investors, it depends on the type of investor you're working with. There are like Silicon Valley, Bay Area investors who see a lot more deal flow. And typically what they will say is they want to see a passionate founder who understands the problem in a market that's scalable and they can see some line with becoming a bigger company, right? And typically you got to be looking at a market size minimum like 10 billion. And that's like really looking kind of small. And so that's far and above beyond like what the legislative branch, spends. And so that doesn't work. So you got to convince them of that. So you shouldn't have to convince a retail investor that knows how to do this. The problem is important. East Coast VCs see a lot less funding. Incubators, like, think tanks that do like funding. I don't believe in any of those things. I don't think those are sophisticated investors. And I think you're going to have a lot of trouble with them in the long run. So I only look for like retail, like blue chip investors who've done this a lot if I can. So I don't know. I don't want to keep answering all these questions, Ananda, but this next one is like perfect for me, but I will stop talking.
We'll let Jonathan chime in and then we'll come back.
Yeah. I'll say a couple of things. The first is I think that the structure that you were using, Alex, around things that you need versus want versus should do is a really good one. A similar structure which is around kind of finding the right problem. When you're thinking of finding the solution, right? Then first you have to find the right problem. That is the most important thing. And understanding the problem, the needs, and kind of the users that you're trying to go solve is the most important thing. I wanted to then kind of talk about the next step, which is kind of what I think many of Yuri's questions kind of get into, which is then, okay, you found your problem. Now you want to move into solution mode. What do you do? And I think that there's multiple kind of filtering steps when you're trying to figure out which business ideas make the most sense. The first being, is it the right problem? And the second being, can I solve it? Because something that I talk about with startups is that every startup has to overcome at least one impossible challenge. And every startup has the same first impossible challenge, which is you have to build a team and a product and a solution that can exist, right? You have to build it and kind of create something from nothing. And that is kind of every startup has that impossible problem. Some startups have more than one impossible problem. And you'll find that the more impossible problems that you have to solve, the harder it's going to be to create a business and actually be able to solve the problem. Those other impossible things could be, you have to build unproven technology to do something that doesn't exist. SpaceX is something that has kind of really only had the impossible problem of needing to build the company, but then the impossible problem of needing to build rockets that actually work, which congratulations to them, they figured it out. But there's low probability of success in doing anything there. Some companies, and this is why network companies are so hard, is that you often have two impossible problems on top of the kind of creating the company to begin with. If you're Uber, you both have to convince people to ride in strangers' cars, and you have to convince people to drive strangers in their car. And those are two similar and impossible problems. Congratulations to them, they solved it. Many, many, many others haven't. And so one of the things that I suggest to founders, and I think this connects to the comment that Alex just made, which is don't build from scratch if you which is depending on your business model, right? If you can choose a solution that has as few impossible problems as possible, you will almost certainly be able to solve the problem more easily. If you aren't having to use untested technology, if you don't have to go convince multiple markets to do something in order for anyone to get value, you have a higher probability of success. The other thing that I wanted to mention is I'm a software engineer by training. I'm the CTO. I built all the tech. So I won't comment as much on where you find that person or how you build those skills. I have lots to say on that topic. But the thing I did want to touch on is I think that everyone thinks that the first step in starting a business is getting funding. And so much of our culture celebrates the fundraising as the thing that is the success, right? What do you hear about entrepreneurs? Like, oh, they raised $10 million. Like, good for them. They must be successful entrepreneurs. And as a founder that bootstrapped my business for the first 6 years of its existence and got very, very far without any external funding, you don't have to do that. You don't have to go kind of the route that everybody thinks is the right thing to do, which is go raise the ton of money and go, build the brand new from scratch solution. You can and probably should at first try to solve the problem yourself, even in the most minimal way that you can with the most cobbled together of tools. It is astonishing how many startups can start as a Google form and a couple of plugins that already exist. And so my biggest recommendations then are find the things that have the easiest problems to solve and the fewest impossible things, and recognize that you don't have to build the perfect solution out the gate. You need to validate the problem first.
For sure. And I'm going to ask these couple questions in the chat out loud for those listening to the recording. So can you talk a little more about finding tech products and solutions and building on top of something versus building from scratch? And then how do you find someone to build the tech that will solve for your solution? For example, I've got an idea. How do I make it a reality if I don't code myself? I know Alex was also answering some in the chat if you want to talk a little more about that too.
Yeah, so first off, so the first technology company I started was in the early 2000s. And at that point you had to build everything yourself. Like AWS didn't really exist. Like Rackspace didn't even really exist. And so my company had physical infrastructure. We had blade servers that we were provisioning, and I had to go to the data center and clean them out because they would get dusty. Just to make sure our applications were working, right? Like that was insane. Today, not only do you not have to build that stuff from scratch because there's all these like services to make it possible, you don't even really have to build your product from scratch. Like you can take an existing product and modify it really cheaply without a developer whatsoever and make it work. Like that's what Indigov is. Like Indigov is built on top of a $30 billion company called Zendesk, right? Like I didn't want my engineers to have to build all the backend and security infrastructure and databases. I instead wanted to pull that in from a company that was much further along than we were. And so we concentrated all of our development effort on building custom user features on top of that to dramatically accelerate our feature density. That's one of the reasons we have so many innovative features, is that I didn't have to do all that other stuff. And then you can make a decision later on whether or not you need to like migrate off of that stack. You know, that's not something that we'll need to do, but maybe you want to. And so you definitely don't want to build it. You want to focus all of your time and the finite resources you have on building things that only you can do, the very specific vision of the world that you see. Like even today, like you don't have to design things yourself. Like if you're designing an onboarding flow for a mobile application, you're out of your damn mind. There's a million other companies that have already done that and optimized it perfectly, and you can just do what they do. And so you really need to figure out, again, what's out there. And so if you're going to build something or design something or be a product person, you have to become an expert in other products to figure out what you don't have to reinvent. Because good designers, good product people will speak in metaphors. They'll be like, I want to use the login flow from Airbnb. I want to use the timestamps from iMessage. I want to use the gallery control from Path, or like this over here. They speak in metaphors. And so I would take literally millions of screenshots of like apps on my phone to understand like what other people were doing at the beginning of my career so that I could do it more effectively. And so like summary, never build it from scratch if you don't have to. That's always a gigantic mistake. Finding people to build the tech stuff, like assume that you don't need a super technical person at the beginning. Like don't think, like Jonathan was saying, like don't assume you have to raise money. Don't assume you need a technical co-founder. Like you may be able to do a lot of these things on your own. I do think you need someone else to do it with you. They don't necessarily have to be technical, but it's really hard, long road to build something yourself without other people to bounce ideas off of and at least validate or invalidate some of the things you're doing. The dialectic is a huge part of democracy and a huge part of starting companies at the beginning. You need someone to tell you no and argue with you. So if it's not a full-time or part-time co-founder, at least it's got to be people in your corner that are invested in what you're building emotionally and intellectually to like give you some feedback. And you know, it's not an easy place to find people, but I would say if you're talking to a venture funder, and I used to be a venture capitalist, they would tell you that they're not going to invest in a founder who met their co-founder at a networking event. Ideally, it's somebody in your life that you've already known for a while, that you've worked together on multiple projects before or just been interested in before. My co-founder for Indigov, we worked on like, 7 or 8 projects spread out over years before we did the company together and grew it and raised money and all the other things we did. So, ideally pick someone that you already know and work with well, even if their technical skill set doesn't fit exactly what you're looking for. Trust and experience goes a long way.
And I will add to that. So for me, the CTO that I work with, Neil, well, when I first came out with the idea, I was like, how after starting it in terms of testing, am I going to actually implement? Because I myself couldn't build the technology on its own. I had an idea, I had a roadmap, and then I also built myself an MVP based on, there's a couple web platforms that you can go to just sketch what you're visioning and be like, this is what I would want to build. And then eventually I went to like hackathons, I went to different like congressional hackathons, and I met different people, but it didn't really click, because when you're thinking about a co-founder or somebody to bounce ideas off with, there needs to be trust. Like not only are you building a company, you will be financially tied to this individual and like emotionally tied, because you guys will go through the trenches. And then I started to look at your network. So one of the things too is like, look back at your college network, at your grad school network, of people you may have worked with in the past that may be in technology and want to pick up a little side project for you for a little bit. And the way I did it was, I was like, hey, Neil, like, do you know someone? I'm thinking about this idea. I really think, and I explained to him what I was thinking of building. And then he was like, wait, I could do that. And he and I had a good working relationship from college. And then since then, it's just like worked for us. And we have a very good cadence of working together. And that's how I got my CTO, was it like within my network, someone who he has a current other thing that he's working on, but he spends 30 hours a week updating the technology that we need. And so find someone who's willing to, like Alex said, maybe work part-time or, you know, whatever hours that they have to help get you started. And then eventually when you build the company out, you can hire more people once you intake revenue. But when we first started, we bootstrapped. We did not take any investor funding, and we work sweat equity. Like we own, both of us own pretty much all of the company. And it's because we work through that. But you have to understand too, if you jump off the hill, there isn't a for sure paycheck. You need to figure out where that money is going to come from. And that's also why I launched the Congressional App Challenge in tandem of launching Tour Tracker, is that was a gig that paid me during the like work hours. And then I worked another full 8 hours on like building out Tour Tracker until it was sustainable. And then I left the Congressional App Challenge, a fully paid job, to then run the company once it was fully on board. We locked in contracts. So you have to think about it that way too, that if you don't have a stream of funding coming in, where are you going to pay your next paycheck? I did double job. I like ran the Congressional App Challenge, and then I also built out Tour Tracker. And once Tour Tracker got clients and money coming in and I can make that a sustainable living, that's when I fully went on board with Tour Tracker and then handed off the Congressional App Challenge.
Oh, thank you so much for everyone for sharing all of your stories and for being here today. I know we've just hit time at 11. If anyone wants to get the recording, I'm happy to email that out and we'll post it as well. So feel free to send me a message if you want that link. But other than that, thank you all again for joining us, and be on the lookout for the next series that we do on Tech Off the Hill, or Tech on the Hill, which will be in a couple of weeks. Have a good rest of your Friday. Oh, we also have a survey that we just sent out on staff retention. I can send this link around as well. We're going to have a briefing next Wednesday at noon on staff retention from different chiefs of staff who have really good retention in their offices. We put together a report based on responses we got from 20 different chiefs with best retention on the Hill. So I can send that out as well.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks, Nana.
Have a good long weekend.
Thanks. You guys too. Bye.